Inside the mind of a serial killer, Warren Greaves, the man who became the nightmare. He wasn't the kind of man you'd notice, not the kind you'd fear. Warren Greaves worked at a library. He smiled. He shelved books. But underneath the quiet smile was something calculated, something cold, something watching. And when they finally opened the door to his basement, they didn't just uncover a crime. They uncovered a design. This is not just a story about a killer. It's a story about control, silence, and the terrifying power of the mind. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of human psychology, subscribe now and stay with us. This story only gets deeper. Let's begin. The Mask. Warren Greaves was not born a monster. He was born quiet. From his very first breath, it was as if the world had already exhausted its noise quota. He didn't cry, didn't wail, just opened his eyes and looked around, almost like he was taking notes. Nurses said he was the calmest infant they'd ever seen. His mother, Marlene, called it a blessing. It wasn't. In childhood, Warren was described as well-mannered, intelligent, introverted, the kind of boy who lined up his toys by size and memorized the layout of every room he entered. Teachers said he was remarkably well-behaved. What they didn't mention was how deeply unsettling it was that he never laughed unless prompted. How he never played tag, only watched, always watching. By third grade, he could recite the capitals of every country on earth. But he had no friends, not one. When asked why, he answered without hesitation. They're unpredictable. His father, Harold Greaves, a retired army man, liked to blame the boy's strangeness on his wife's over-intellectualized parenting. She, in turn, blamed Harold's coldness. Neither of them realized the truth. Warren didn't become distant. He simply never learned to be close. There were moments, strange ones, when something slipped through his cracks. One morning at age 9, Marlene found the family dog locked in the pantry, trembling and soaked in its own urine. She never discovered who did it, but Warren, who usually ate his cereal in silence, chewed with a slight smile that morning. When asked about it years later by a forensic psychiatrist, he shrugged. I wanted to see how long it would take before it cried. No remorse, no emotion, just data. As a teenager, Warren drifted through high school like a ghost in khakis. Average grades, no detentions, no clubs, no photos in the yearbook beyond the required ID. But there was one teacher, Mrs. Ilston, psychology elective, who made a mistake. She told him he was gifted with insight. Warren lashed onto the phrase like a religious chant. He began reading more, not stories, not novels, but case studies, crime reports, profiles of violent men who'd been deemed mentally ill, misunderstood, or evil. He didn't read them with fear. He read them with fascination, patterns, escalation, planning. He didn't relate to the rage. He related to the control. He once wrote an essay titled "The Predictive Behaviors of Dissociative Minds in Suburban Settings." That was so unnervingly clinical. It was flagged and brought to the attention of the school counselor. They called his parents, recommended a therapist. Harold dismissed it as overreaction. He's a thinker, he said. They didn't press further, and Warren, ever the good student, smiled and thanked them for their concern. That was his gift. He made people feel safe in their dismissal. After graduation, he attended community college, chose library sciences. It was quiet, methodical, unobserved. He took to it immediately. By 24, he was offered a full-time position at the Ashton Hollow Public Library. That's where he stayed for 22 years. Same desk, same thermos, same pressed shirts. He filed books by day, filed people by night. It started innocently. Observations in a notebook, behavioral habits of patrons, rival toms, conversation patterns, favorite authors. But soon, it evolved. He categorized them into types: talkers, thinkers, wanderers, watchers. Each one was color-coded. He kept the notebook locked in a desk drawer, behind a false panel. No one ever found it. He began testing his theories. He'd rearrange a display and log who noticed, who adjusted, Who panicked? Who told the staff? He once moved a bookmark from one patron's return novel to another. When the first patron returned, he asked them about the ending. They hadn't read it, claimed they had. Warren marked them as insecure, deceptive. He wasn't mocking them. He wasn't even angry. He was simply collecting truth. But truth, when it festers, becomes something else. He started following people, not in a predatory way, not at first. He simply walked behind them, matched their steps, watched how often they turned around, if they changed pace, if they stopped to tie a shoe just to let him pass. He never spoke, never touched, but they felt him. And that feeling, the ripple of anxiety, the shift in energy, it thrilled him. He once followed a woman from the library to her home. Her name was Talia. She was a substitute teacher, 31, divorced, wore the same perfume every Thursday. He followed her 6 times, never on consecutive days, never at the same time. On the 7th, she vanished. No body was found. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle. She was simply gone. Warren didn't write about her directly. But that week, he opened a new journal labeled Environmental Interruptions. The first page read, Subject T, removed, pattern stabilized. When Talia's photograph showed up in the newspaper under missing person, he clipped it out, filed it under archive, confirmed, and then he went to work the next day, smiling, helpful, just like always. The collector, by the time Warren Greaves turned 30, he had become a master of routines. Every morning began the same way. Alarm at 6:15, shower, oatmeal with 1 tablespoon of brown sugar, a single cup of black coffee, then 10 minutes standing at the living room window, watching the street, logging any changes. A new car, a new trash bin, a new face. He kept a journal titled Deviations. His neighbors never noticed him watching, or maybe they did, and just didn't care. After all, he wasn't threatening. He was quiet, lived alone, paid his bills, mowed his lawn every Thursday. The very picture of harmless solitude. But Warren was never alone. Not really. He had his files. They filled an entire room in his house, file cabinets, labeled boxes, binders thick with annotations. People thought hoarders collected junk. Warren collected behavior. He cataloged everyone he interacted with, not just names and addresses, but how often they blinked when nervous, the number of times they checked their phones during conversations, how they hesitated before answering certain questions, their micro-reactions to compliments or criticism. He wasn't guessing. He was studying, refining, correcting. By now, he had files on over 300 individuals, organized into subcategories: passive, reactive, erratic, predictable. Each had a control score. It was a number from 1 to 10. The higher the score, the easier it was for Warren to manipulate them mentally, emotionally, socially. He never told anyone, not because he was afraid, but because he believed they wouldn't understand. He didn't think of himself as deviant. He thought of himself as elevated. Most people waste their days reacting. Warren planned his. He tested his control score system in subtle ways. He'd ask someone for a favor, then track how long it took them to comply. He'd tell a harmless lie, then observe whether they challenged it. He once told a coworker he liked her jacket. She wasn't wearing one. She looked confused, then smiled and thanked him. Warren wrote, Subject A17, compliance via social discomfort, suggestible. He didn't smile. He just logged the result. The world didn't reward observers. But this was something else. It rewarded action. And Warren, he was ready to act. It began small. Disruptions. He swapped mail between neighbors, left anonymous notes under windshield wipers. Phrases like "she knows" or "you forgot the window." Nothing threatening, just noise, just enough to make them second guess. He once placed a dead bird on a neighbor's welcome mat, watched from his window as she screamed, dropped her groceries, and called animal control. He logged her reaction time, 3 minutes, 40 seconds. What disturbed Warren most wasn't her panic. It was how exhilarating it felt. He realized something that day. Observation was no longer enough. He needed to feel their fear shape it. So he began choosing his subjects more carefully. Women who lived alone, men who drank too much, couples on the brink of separation, people vulnerable in different ways. He became an architect of unease. Sometimes he just moved things. A trash can nudge slightly to the left, a porch chair turned inward. But other times, he entered their homes, not to steal, not to hurt, just to stand in their space, breathe their air, shift their reality. He'd rearrange magnets on a fridge, unplug an alarm clock, adjust the position of a shampoo bottle, and then leave, silently, completely. He once visited the same apartment 3 times in a month. The woman who lived there eventually called the police. They found no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no missing items, just a single, unlit candle in the center of her kitchen table, placed perfectly. She moved away 2 weeks later. Warren added her file to the retired subjects drawer. He placed a green sticker on the folder. Green meant successful exit. He never questioned what he was doing, never lost sleep. To him, it was a form of art, a clean art, no mess, no blood, just fear, pure and quiet, distilled into a few simple moments. But eventually, he wanted more. Control wasn't enough if it was temporary. He wanted permanence. He wanted to leave a mark not visible, but psychological, lasting. So he began studying what scared people the most. Not death, not pain, but being watched, without knowing when or why, being judged by someone you'll never meet. He started taking items, a sock, a toothbrush, a photo from a frame, little things, always from people who wouldn't notice right away. He returned some of them a week later damaged slightly. A tear in the fabric, a scratch on the glass, proof that he'd been there, that he had touched their lives. He didn't do it for thrill. He did it because it confirmed something he always believed. They didn't deserve privacy. They wasted their lives, spoke without thought, loved without depth, reacted like animals. He wasn't one of them. He was the one taking notes, the one controlling the script. He once wrote, "Control is the only true form of intimacy. All else is guesswork." He began sleeping less, eating less. Every moment became part of the process. And then he crossed the line. He followed a man named Curtis Day, middle-aged, lived alone, former factory worker, social drinker, kept to himself. Warren watched him for 6 months. One night, Curtis left his front door unlocked. Warren slipped in. Curtis was asleep. Warren stood over him for 17 minutes. He counted Curtis's breaths, logged the temperature of the room, watched his REM patterns. Then he reached down and touched his forehead. Curtis stirred, muttered something, turned. Warren left before he woke up. Curtis reported the incident the next morning. No evidence, no forced entry, just a feeling, a lingering dread. He stopped going to work, bought new locks, started drinking heavier. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his garage, carbon monoxide poisoning. Ruled a suicide. Warren wrote in his journal, Subject C51, failure of resilience, predictable collapse, unnecessary cleanup. He began visiting Curtis's grave every Sunday for a month, not out of guilt, but to observe who else came. No one ever did. That's when Warren knew. He was ready. No more trials, no more temporary subjects. He would begin preserving his work, and that meant changing everything. The Diaries. Warren Greaves was a man of discipline, but even discipline has its rituals. His most sacred, writing. He kept notebooks stacked, numbered, sealed in plastic sleeves like sacred relics. Not 1, not 10, 42 each bound in leather, each filled from cover to cover with neat, obsessively controlled handwriting. They weren't journals. They were autopsies, not of bodies, but of moments, of decisions, of impulses sharpened into execution. Each entry began the same. Observation log, date, subject code, and each ended with a cold, impersonal summary. Behavior confirmed. Variable suppressed. Control re-established. Some were brief. Simple accounts of social interactions. Subject AO3 showed reluctance in accepting unsolicited assistance. Flushed face. Defensive tone. Resisted eye contact. Concluded. Low submission potential. Others were elaborate. Entire chapters detailing conversations, reactions, follow-up encounters. But as time progressed, the tone shifted. Detached observation gave way to personal philosophy. The notebooks evolved from logs to manifestos. He began referring to his actions not as intrusions, but as calibrations. He described his subjects as unclean signals, noise in a system that required refinement. He even renamed his journals the Index of Stillness. In one volume, he wrote, "I do not hate. I do not rage. These are human errors. I correct. I minimize deviation. I restore the frequency." Page after page, Warren documented a worldview in which silence was the highest form of order. Stillness was morality. Cleanliness wasn't about hygiene, it was about absence. Absence of noise, of unpredictability, of emotion. He began sketching diagrams, circles within circles, arrows pointing to words like suppression, clarity, isolation, not random scribbles, but structured like blueprints. Blueprints for something larger, something permanent. One page contained only this sentence, repeated over and over. "I see them. I measure them. I decide." And another, he posed questions to himself. What is the moral weight of an action? If I observe suffering and do not end it, am I cruel? Or is cruelty allowing defective patterns to persist? And in response, his own answer, compassion is a flaw. The machine does not weep when removing rust. Warren began to write at night. 4 hours, hands aching, fingers blistered, eyes red. But he didn't stop. He wrote about what it felt like to control someone's life without them knowing, to be a phantom pulling strings with surgical precision. He wrote about walking into homes and leaving marks so subtle the owners thought they were imagining things. He called it thought seeding. He even tracked the emotional arc of his subjects from stability to doubt to fear to breakdown. Each subject was assigned a projected decay timeline. Subject F12. Initial phase resistance. Middle phase paranoia. Final phase submission or collapse. And almost every time, he was right. But there was one journal that stood out among the rest. Black leather, worn at the edges, bound tighter than the others, hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of The Interpretation of Dreams by Freud. He never labeled this one. He simply called it the core. Inside, Warren abandoned formality. He wrote not as an observer but as a god. One passage. "I am not here to be understood. I am not here to be seen. I am the editor, the red pen in the margins of human failure. I do not correct grammar. I correct existence." Another entry detailed a moment of what he called pure order. She was lying in bed. I stood over her, not touching, not speaking, just watching. Her breathing changed. Her eyes fluttered beneath the lids. The moment she knew someone was there but couldn't prove it, that was the apex. That was the truth. He never named her, never described what happened after. He didn't need to. The pages told the story in absence. One of the final entries in the black journal read, "The others are awakening. Something stirs in the margins. A detective looking twice. A neighbor slowing their walk. The signal is at risk of contamination. Time to accelerate." He drew a clot beneath it. No numbers, just black marks where the hands should be. He started burning some of his older notebooks. He didn't want redundancy. He didn't want anyone tracing his early patterns. He wanted his message to be perfect, distilled, pure. The last page in that final journal held only 5 words, etched into the page with such pressure. The pen tore through the paper. Noise must not inherit silence. Then nothing. The rest of the journal was blank, but only in writing. To Warren, those empty pages were finished chapters, because the act had already begun, and the world had no idea what was coming next. The basement, the complaint came in on a Monday. Denise Hill, 73, called it in herself. Her voice, trembling but firm, told the dispatcher that something was wrong at the Greaves house. Not suspicious activity, not noise, but a smell. It was faint at first, she said, like rotten fruit. But over the last 3 days, it had become unbearable. By 9:30 a.m., the officers were at the curb in front of 108 Rosefield Lane, a pale, beige house with trimmed hedges, freshly cut grass, and not a single window open. Everything about the place looked still. They knocked. No answer. They rang the bell. Silence. After a forced entry warrant and 20 minutes of waiting for a locksmith, the door creaked open. What they found inside wasn't chaos. It wasn't filth. It was perfection. Every item in the house had a place. Every surface dustless. Every drawer aligned like surgical instruments on a tray. It was the kind of home that felt more curated than lived in. But it wasn't the order that disturbed them. It was the smell. It grew thicker as they descended toward the basement. Behind a door with 3 deadbolts, they found a staircase. Each step down made the air heavier, like it was pressing against their lungs. At the bottom, concrete floors, no windows, industrial lighting, and one wall that didn't match the others. Hollow, newer. It took the officers less than 10 minutes to find the hidden seam. Behind it, a room, 10 feet by 10, no furniture, save for a single steel chair bolted to the floor, straps on the arms. Dried brown stains on the seat and floor. A drain beneath it, rusted around the edges. Shelves lined with clear plastic bins, each labeled in handwriting so neat it made the contents worse. Cloth fibers, hair samples, nail clippings, photographs of sleeping faces. On one wall, a pegboard with tools, blades, pliers, syringes arranged by size and function. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the camera in the corner. It was pointed directly at the chair. The footage it contained would later be reviewed in a private room by federal agents. Only one tape had a label, Prototype 0. The contents of that recording have never been released to the public. But the 2 officers who first watched it left the force within the year. One refused to speak of it. The other described it only once under the influence of heavy painkillers. He said, it wasn't what he did. It was how quiet it all was. Like the pain didn't matter. Like the silence was the point. Forensics later confirmed at least 4 victims had been held in that room. DNA traces matched missing persons from the area: 2 women, 1 man, 1 unidentified. The walls were lined with pages torn from psychology textbooks, annotated in red ink. Sentences circled, phrases underlined. The illusion of choice is the cornerstone of compliance. Pain is effective. Silence is permanent. A subject's stillness confirms control. And at the very center of the back wall, a mirror, full-length, clean, unbroken, facing the chair. So whoever sat there saw themselves. Not Warren, just them. They recovered journals from a locked drawer, entries that described the room not as a prison, but as a refining chamber. Warren called it the quiet room. One passage read, "They scream at first, not because of the pain, but because they still believe someone is listening." But the strangest thing, Warren was not in the house, not hiding, not on the run. He was found 2 days later, sitting on a bench at the town cemetery, wearing a suit and holding a single daffodil. When officers approached, he didn't move, didn't resist. He looked up, smiled, and said, "I've already cleaned what needed cleaning." During his arrest, he remained perfectly calm, not smug, not deranged, just calm, as if the outcome had always been part of the plan. When asked by investigators why he built the room, why he documented everything, why he did what he did, his response was as cold as the steel chair in the basement. Some people write books, others erase them. The Mirror, they sentenced Warren Greaves to 5 consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole. The trial lasted 3 weeks. He spoke only once, not to apologize, not to deny, but to correct a technical detail in the forensic timeline. When the prosecutor described his crimes as acts of savagery, Warren tilted his head slightly and said, "There was nothing savage about it. I was precise." His defense team tried for an insanity plea. It didn't hold. The state psychiatrist ruled him competent, lucid, even brilliant. A man whose decisions were not born from impulse, but from design. Warren didn't flinch when the judge handed down the sentence. He blinked once, then sat back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. That was the last time the public saw his face. But inside Greystone Correctional Facility, he became a myth. Inmates avoided him, not out of fear, but because he watched, like always, silently, measuring. He kept to himself, speaking only when spoken to, writing endlessly in notebooks that prison officials were not allowed to confiscate. His cell was spotless, bed made every morning with military precision. One book at a time on the shelf, one mirror mounted to the wall, directly across from the bunk. He spent hours each day just looking, not grooming, not admiring, just staring. When asked what he saw, he answered, the same thing I always saw, the mask. The prison staff joked that Warren's cell was quieter than solitary. He didn't pace, didn't talk to himself, didn't dream. He simply existed. One of the guards, a veteran named Felix, said, "He looks like he's listening to something no one else can hear." Warren received letters, dozens, from students, from psychologists, from morbid admirers who wanted to know more. Sometimes he responded, never directly, never emotionally, but with theory, analysis. Once, he replied to a criminology student's question about remorse with this: "Remorse is a social currency. You spend it when you want leniency." I'm not shopping. Over time, he began publishing essays under a pseudonym. They appeared in niche journals, underground philosophy blogs. No one could prove they were his. But the tone, the structure, the content, it was unmistakable. Titles like The Art of Subtraction or Silence as a Form of Ownership. He claimed that stillness was the most honest language a human could express. He argued that morality was an illusion curated by fear. That power didn't come from force, but from restraint. That to take something from someone and leave nothing behind was the purest form of authorship. But the mirror remained. Every day, without fail, Warren would sit on the edge of his bed and look into it, as if he was waiting for something or watching for a crack. Staff asked if he wanted it removed. He refused, said it was part of the study. They let it be. And over the years, a strange thing happened. Warren's legend grew. Documentaries, podcasts, speculative books with titles like The Whispering Killer or Portrait of a Librarian. None of them got it right. They focused on the victims, on the basement, on the journals. They missed the point. Warren wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was trying to erase noise, to simplify, to cleanse. When asked if he regretted anything, Warren said, "Regret implies deviation. I followed the outline exactly." One winter, a young psychologist named Dr. Emily Crane was granted interview access. She spent for sessions with Warren. He never blinked more than once every 30 seconds. Never raised his voice above a whisper. She described him in her notes as the most present person I've ever met, and somehow the most absent. In their final session, she asked what he would do if he were released. He didn't pause. "I would sit on the same bench, at the same cemetery, and finish the sentence I was writing." When she asked what that sentence was, he smiled for the first time. A tiny, effortless smile. "You were never the author." That night, she requested reassignment. Warren kept writing, kept watching, kept waiting. Until one morning, during a routine cell check, the mirror was found shattered. Not cracked, shattered. Tiny shards covering the floor. No signs of struggle. No signs of violence. Warren was sitting on the bed, staring at the wall. The guards asked what happened. He didn't speak, didn't move. He didn't blink for a full 2 minutes. And then, quietly, he whispered, "Now I see the face." He never explained what he meant. Never mentioned it again. But from that day on, he stopped writing, stopped eating, just sat, facing the wall where the mirror had been, eyes open, waiting, as if, for the first time in his life, He wasn't looking out, but in, and whatever he saw there, it was enough.